Okay, so I'm pleased to be here. This is 2023, and I'm really pleased to say that 20 years ago, or thereabouts, just about what, 2001, when I was lecturing at Winchester University, just down the road from Bournemouth, um, we didn't have Nollywood. What we had was not known as Nollywood. So that's in itself a place for us to start. And if we're thinking about it, in 20 years, this is where we are. But what I'm going to do today is to look at the challenge of historicization. That word is challenging. So I'm looking at imagining, imaginations, and imaginaries. Why is this important? I'm looking also at the way in which we define film and Nollywood, which will be, in a sense, help us to understand the challenges that we have when we speak about Nollywood. Then I go on to talk about the aspect of Nollywood that not many people know about, especially because we have Rogers here, who embodies where we are now, which is where we're going to. So I'm going to spend a bit of time trying to tease some of these things out for us. And I need to put my clock on so that I'm mindful of the time I have. Okay, right. So that said, the first thing to note is the fact that according to the philosopher Karl Popper, there's no history, only histories. And it's important for us to bear that in mind so that when we start, I'm putting my clock on, I beg your pardon, so that when we start thinking about encountering the kind of contentions that we are likely to encounter when we speak of Nollywood, then we'll understand. And I'm saying that to declare bias, to say, I'm here for a reason. I'm here with looking at different perspectives and not just trying to look at different perspectives, trying to synthesize different perspectives for us. So let's go on to look at this whole thing about imaginaries. Yeah. What are the versions of history that we have? We'll come to, but for now, let's look at some of my key words. We're looking at the word imaginaries. And from that, I'm looking at why is that important? Why not images? Why not imaginations? Of course, we know that film is about stories. Film is about images, it's mimetic in orientation. And also, for us to get those images, we're having to imagine. The script writer is actually somebody. When I teach script writing, I say to my students, you are like gods. You are mini gods, you are creators, you create your own world. So then a writer is having to think about, he has to use his imagination to determine the spaces that we want to be, to determine what will work in those spaces, to determine the people, the characters that he wants to place in there, what kind of relationships they're going to have, and indeed to look beyond all of that and say, where do we go from here? These are important because when we've shared them, when we subscribe to them, we start to have common sets of values. We start to have common reference points. And in other words, what we're saying is we start to have social or cultural imaginaries that can guide us, that can guard us, that may propel us or may restrict us. And when we say this, it's good for us to know that we are actually talking about ideology in a sense. We're talking about identity in a sense. We're looking at how do we start to imagine ourselves as a nation. Hence, I talked about constructing nations? How do we look at ourselves as a group, ethnic group, or even nationalities, and even nations, as in the Nigerian nation, which is so diverse? We'll come to that. So indeed, imaginations and imaginaries are consequential. Yeah, the imaginations that go into the process of filmmaking are, and the output that we get are consequential. They help to bring us together. They help to either bring us together or set us apart. And I'm saying this for us to know that I'm using the idea of Benedict Anderson when he talks about imagined communities. How do we imagine ourselves together? What are those things? We tend to think of imagined communities as those places where we come together, where we are united. But bearing in mind that issues of identity can actually be quite divisive, it's important for us to note that it's not always bringing us together. It could also be otherwise. It could do otherwise. Okay, so stories and storytelling, as I said, are ways that we can share our imaginations, and film is not alone in doing this. Film, like television and music, has a strong language. Film has a strong language, especially when we think about the kind of audiences that may be not so literate in terms of reading, because books can also do the same thing. Literature can also do the same thing, can help us to build ideas of who we are and where we want to be. So, but then when we're thinking about how those imaginations are circulated, imaginations about places, about spaces, about people and possessions and customs, all those things are more easily done by the audiovisual medium, which is accessible to many, especially those who are not literate. And we have a lot of them in the Nigerian space, or maybe in the African space, or maybe in the third world. But even, I dare say that even in the seeming first or second world, that the ease of getting the information, the ease by which we access the information in film, the fact that sometimes it's really a place where our guard is down, we're coming in to be entertained, then it might be a way that we have not quite fully explored when we think about how impactful film can be. But let's move on. So we know that because imaginaries are socially constructed, it's appropriate for us to see what are the prompts, what are the images that are paraded for us to see. So need I say that film is ideological? And imaginaries, besides being ideological, are also to some extent a source of concern, particularly when you think about relations between nations. It's a source of concern because we know that ideology is soft power. And so the idea of the construction of identity and patterns of consumption, which may have economic manifestations, they may have economic implications, are important for us to attend to. So these are consequential to power relations, these imaginaries that we're talking about. Okay, and it's not just a situation that we look at. When I say it's consequential to power relations, I'm asking us to think about power relations within nations to start with. And it may not seem, I don't know which nation, I'm not too sure that there's any nation that's actually properly homogeneous. We used to think before we came to live in the UK, that the UK was just the one monolithic, because everybody speaks English, then it must be one monolithic country. But no, it's not. I mean, it's still rather multicultural, even if you took away the immigrants, the ethnic minority populations. there's still diversity within a space that seems so homogeneous like the UK. So you can imagine how much of a challenge we would have in a country which is much more diverse in terms of the ethnic composition. So it's consequential to power relationships, whether in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of class. There are all kinds of ways by which we can plot the identity, and we can start to see, indeed, even in terms of geographical space, north-south relations, what's happening up north, what's happening in the south of England. And the same thing in Nigeria. You can look at the diverse ways in which the geo-regional positions would affect the relationships. Beyond that, let's now come to that which seems to be a lot more, which seemed at some point to be a lot more of a concern, that is power relations within nations. And because the nations that had the technology were the ones who dominated the film industry at some point, it was such that we would consider the erosion of culture. The whole idea of cultural imperialism was something that was big when we considered the influence of film. So indeed, these are some of the challenges that we have. So yes, there might be unity in diversity, but we need to think about climate, creed, language, generation, culture, and so forth when we're thinking about the people that are being presented, or the imaginaries that we are saddled with. How does the imaginaries that we have, how does it affect the different people? What's the dominant message that we're getting, and how does that affect those people who are the minorities? Because yes, it may be dominant. That's why I started with that quote, to say it's about history, but it's really not just history, it's about histories. It's knowing the different groups. And I think that's one thing that Nollywood has also tried to grapple, or is still trying to grapple with. Okay, so a few images here just to break the chatter, to show that indeed Nigeria is not quite as it's not quite as homogeneous. No, I don't think anyone ever thought it was homogeneous. So we can go from the what do you call it, the seaside or riverside. We can go up to the north. We can see what do you call it, the vegetation, places in the vegetation. We can see even the difference between what happens outside and what happens inside. What's the space like that we have? What happens outside? What happens in inside homes? What do we do within domestic spaces? I've used an example of an image here from the seaside with the women, with the people in their white garment. That's evidence of a particular creed. That's calling attention to a particular kind of creed. They're not just Christians, they're white garment Christians. And we tend to encounter them quite a bit in Nollywood. Okay, so we also have people who, I'm not quite sure what's going on in that place with the with the boom mic, but the person obviously seems to be tying just a wrapper, which would say, what kind of custom is this? This is something that I know maybe would have caused some kind of offense at some point. Why are you presenting women like this? Why do you present the woman to be objectified? I've not used one that's offensive, but then this seems to be a benign, everyday kind of image that you will find in some kind of low income group area, the squatter areas of urban society. The view that we have of the man holding the woman in that space, that's a nice cozy space. That looks like a nice cozy relationship that's on parade there. But then what are we talking about there? Is it saying that the woman is incomplete, is dependent on the man, what does that mean? Is it intimacy and love, or is it really some more dynamics that a feminist reading of that image could present? So just to give us an example of the kinds of differences, a few more. Right. We have, oops, yeah, okay. We have this image, which some of us might remember. I've come from the place of the poverty that Nollywood in its stereotypical form would have been presenting, to the opulence that some other end, the other end would of Nollywood would present. So the building which you have on to the left of you, is that the left of your screen? The building which you have there, in fact, both buildings that you see there will kind of connote some kind of opulence. And what do we see there is this, even we see this kind of opulence sometimes, not just in the urban areas. Nollywood brings them to us even in sometimes in the rural areas, in the rural settings. So we do see opulence, and it becomes something for us to aspire to. Now, the image of the woman hugging the man, Shola Shobwale, I'm sure some of you would recognize that from Wedding Party. This would be an example of the newer versions of Nollywood, if Rogers would allow me to call them Nollywood. Okay, I say that again because there's that quarrel almost, for lack of a better word, there's the distancing from some parts of the market to some kinds of Nollywood practices in Nollywood, and you shall see why in a moment. The house there is with the vehicles was also put there just to give an illustration of the kind of opulence. I couldn't quite find the right image, but I confess that I cheated on this one. That last image that you have, I cheated on it because it's not quite Nollywood, although he himself is a bit, well, I suspect that maybe when he's a retired senator, he's a politician who loves the drama, who loves the flamboyance, and just captures the spirit of Nollywood. And they're showing off his vehicles. So the kind of opulence that we have, I debated hard and strong whether to put him there. And in the end, I think I went for broke and put him on. Okay, so the contentions, the term Nollywood itself, it could be contentious unless we unpack its meaning. And the question is, it's a reference, and it's maybe not just a mere label, but also evidence of some aspirations. Now, why have I said that? I'm asking us to think of Nollywood as a reference to an industry with peculiar production values. When it started, I'm talking about the starting in terms of, and I'm putting that in quotes, when it started, that when the milestone, when the name was given, when the name was birthed, it was because it had the video, it was working with video technology, shoestring budget, a radical production schedules, by which I mean 3 days to 3 days shooting and you're done, which maybe is unheard of. But I think more importantly is the fact that Nollywood is more to, when we think of Nollywood, we should think about people with a disruptive kind of attitude, people who have stories to tell. We want to tell our story. So that's the definition that I would prefer for us to go with, to look at people with an attitude, a disruptive attitude. They want to use what they have to offer imaginations of themselves. In other words, we want to use what we have to offer imaginations of ourselves, rather than the dominant colonial imaginaries. Just think about, what did we know of Africa before we started making our own stories? What did we know of ourselves? We were at the mercy of what other people said about us. And maybe also people didn't pay attention to issues that we wanted to talk about, and we needed to talk to ourselves about. Okay, so just examples there of the technology. Okay, you might, just a minute. I beg your pardon. I just realized that, okay.
We'll give you 3 more minutes.
Yeah. 3 minutes. Oh,
three or 5. Let's give you 5 more minutes.
5 minutes, but then I need to, sorry, I need to get under here, and my battery seems to be running down. Okay. I thought it was plugged in, but it seems like...
Take your time. Take your time. We'll wait.
Thank you. Let me just switch this.
Okay, we'll wait. Take your time.
Hello, am I still on?
Yep, you're still on.
Thank God for that. Okay, so right, I need to move quickly now. So in terms of so yeah, we looked at the I hope I've got the battery down. We've looked at the way in which Nollywood has brought all of this technology. So we've come away from the we moved away from reel to reel. Now, how did the name itself come by? It's, in a sense, and a way in which we've used Hollywood as a reference point. And it wasn't the first to use Hollywood as a reference point. It wasn't the first to appropriate Hollywood. Bombay, the Indian cinema, with the B from Bombay with Hollywood came up with Bollywood. And then we have Nigeria going to Hollywood. Now, the big thing I want us to call our attention to is, whereas Bombay is actually a city, a specific location, and where the production is coming from, it becomes easier when you have a specific city, and therefore that the practices in that place. For us in Nigeria, it's not just the city, it's the entire end for Nigeria, with all the diverse practices within the south, the southeast, the southwest, the north of Nigeria. These are all subsumed in that space called Nigeria. And so we're not even sure what Nollywood is. And I've put these images here to see, some of us are even try to put a specific location like Hollywood, and is it real or imagined? I would say that Nollywood is imagined, even though it may be real. Okay, so Nollywood is still an apt term to describe Nigeria's video film industry. We need to be mindful, though, of the variations in between. It's largely a feature of bustling commercial centers in southern Nigeria, and southern Nigeria consists of multiple ethnic groups. The Yoruba-speaking southwest, the Igbo-speaking southeast, and there are many diverse, distinct ethnic, ethno-linguistic groups around the nation, both in the south and in the north. Then Hausa in the north is widely spoken across northern states, and it's home to Kannywood. Now, the reason why I've pointed this out is because the contiguity of language helps to define market and other practices, and may account for the kind of successes that these different groups have had. And again, the cultural practices of those groups may then become evident in the practices that we see within Nollywood. So I ask us to think about the cultural practices of these groups in particular, the Yoruba of the Southwest and the Igbo speaking of the Southeast, who for a long time, in some or by some accounts, would seem to be the ones who claim credit for Nollywood as it was known in 2003. Okay, so back to, just to give a bit more, give a bit more flesh to the story. Look at the origins in terms of colonial, I've tried to put it in blocks. Colonial and post-independence, post-Civil War is one era. Indigenization policy, I'm taking it from the indigenization policy that altered a lot of practices within this society, is the second block. And I looked at 1975 to 1995, for instance, which marks what I call the golden years of television, to the point of rationalization. And all of this, I would argue, sets the stage for Nollywood as we know it. Because if you take the colonial period and post-independence up till the point of the Civil War, we had encountered films. We encountered films through government information films. We encountered silent films for social events, particularly the churches, for instance, when the missionaries came with the message, there would be crusades, but then before the crusades, you would have the film. Charlie Chaplin would do his thing, and then the message would come thereafter. We had newsreels. One thing that we tend to overlook is advertisements. We tend to overlook advertisements because we tend to overlook advertisements. And I think it's something that we need to remember, because advertisements, they had money and they were able to make the films. And I recall that, for instance, with Linters, they would go out to Jamaica and places like that, sets like that, to make films and then treat the films abroad and then bring them to Nigeria. So you have some of those old adverts that we saw that were made in film, made on reel-to-reel, and then taken to television. So we also had commercial films, the Westerns, the Western movies, not just Westerns as a genre, but Western movies as coming from Hollywood and other places, Indian, Chinese, and these had their market. So we had clusters of taste that have been generated by the fare that was in existence. And we also had, to some extent, those who were working, for instance, those who worked on the advertisements and those who worked in television, who were building up gradually the skills. Indigenization policy came along around 1974, 72, 74, thereabouts. And that led to the flight in foreign capital. The Lebanese people who owned the cinemas had to leave, and the cinemas then closed down. But upon their leaving, there was a proliferation of TV stations. Then there was also the assimilation of the traveling theaters into television. And there, with the kinds of collaboration that they had, especially with the academic community, places like the UI, University of Ibadan, they had their own traveling, they had their own shows on television, and they had training programs for some of these traveling theaters. People were acquiring skills, either by practice or by deliberate education. So we move on to the golden days of television, increased training, influx of skilled staff. Those who had gone to train abroad were coming back. There was then the more user-friendly video technology. I call on the production of TV specials in particular, because the TV specials were, as it were, homemade, made for TV films. Yeah, they were like the homemade made for TV films. You know how TV, Hollywood would also have TV movies made for TV, but then we had our own special. So the long productions that we had for public holidays and special days like that, then led us to developing that taste, acquiring that taste, and preparing us for what was to come. Come rationalization, with deregulation and rationalization of the stations, people were let off, people who had skills were let off, and then they became independent producers, not just for television, but also for Nollywood. As you would see, when we think about the opportunity that the glut of the VHS cassette tapes brought in. So it was really a question of trade and technology. Someone had plenty of VHS cassette tapes for sale. What do we do to make this move? We can't just be selling empty tapes. It's not just tapes for shifting viewing, shifting TV viewing. Let's do something else with it. Let's add value to it. Let's make those kind of programs that we have on television and put them on film. And that there came Living in Bondage in 1993. So indeed, all of these things helped, as it were, to bring the silver screen into the home. There was that shifting in of the silver screen into the home. And so we have what we call Nollywood today. How much time do I have some time to go through this, or if I must?
You're out of time, but if you could round up in 2 minutes would be helpful.
Okay, I'll round up in 2 minutes. Let me do this. I wanted to call attention just so to Wole Soyinka's Kongi's Harvest is what I'm showing here. It's the very first production that we had in Nigeria. It's the it was made for silver screen, an adaptation of his book. Now look at the image. My last bullet points, which has sub bullet points, is look at the set and what I've described there as the sets and the what do you call it? Oh dear. Okay. It's set in a rural place. It's about African people and their practices. It's also about their dressing. It's about their food. The story of Kongi's Harvest is about, it was more of him speaking, as it were, to the abuse of power. It wasn't so much wanting to stand against, it wasn't so much standing against images, imaginations of Africans. It wasn't a protest against colonialism in that sense. It was more of a strong discussion with ourselves. Okay, so same thing with the Shehu Muma, which was Kongi's Harvest was 1970. That was down in the South, yeah? The first indigenous film production in Hausa language was in 1976. And that was an adaptation too of a novel that was written apparently by the first Prime Minister, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. He wasn't a prime minister when he'd written that, and it was a story about slavery. And so he was adapted. This was adapted by Adamu Halilu, and that was presented. Now, if you take a look at that space, it's really, as I said, imaginations of homestead. This could be Pangshin in Jaws. These are recognizable spaces. Okay, Ogunde came in a little later, 1980, and he had the trilogy and had also the Ayomo, which was also the story. This was done on silver screen, and Ogunde is the one who we know to be the doyen of theater and the grandfather, as it were, of traveling theater. And they had gone from traveling theater to the screen, but don't forget, in between, they had also been on television. So a lot of the things that went to silver screen had actually, first of all, been tested on the small screen. So you can see that indeed, the Nigerian films, as it were, have helped us to look at the views of homestead and hostlands. There's a lot of traveling back and forth, migration, internal and external migration. Their landscapes of places, their people and their dressing, their cuisines, relationships with family and relationships and family life, customs, festivals, music and dancing. And then of course we get some hints of occupation. I would argue that as it was then, so it remains in Nollywood and beyond. Maybe I should stop there because of time, but let me go quickly. Let me just scroll back to my, I had tried to do some typology of what's happening in rural spaces, what kind of themes, and we can take this a lot further, okay? Let me go to my last slide. So the term Nollywood itself was not without, this is Norimitsu Onishi, who was the reporter, the New York Times reporter that kind of came up with the name. And in the interview that I've, the article that I'm reporting here, he actually said it was not his own making, it was more of a, some sub-editor at the Times, when he had described that it looks like Nollywood, it looks like Bollywood, but it's here. And they came up with the name Nollywood. And he's saying Nollywood is not without its controversy. After all, it's an industry that is seeking to assert its cultural independence. And it's been branded by an American newspaper. Without it, must be said, much deep thought, or maybe even sudden inspiration. Some Nigerians, even non-Nigerians, weren't happy about that. And he spoke of his discussion with Mr. Mahmood Ali Balogun, said more than halfway into a 2-hour talk with Mr. Mahmood Ali Balogun, he asked the question, if he asked him directly, and Ali Balogun's response was, it doesn't matter who names the child, he said with a smile. So it doesn't matter how the name has come to be. It doesn't matter the challenges that we have with it. Let's just take it as a label, almost a handle to describe the variety of practices that we have. I know that Rogers is going to tell us a little bit more. He typifies, in my view, the current place where Nollywood is. And he also has followed a similar trajectory in terms of going from working on television and working on film, working in places where he's done some collaboration. And I'm going to stop here so that we can have a bit more time to enjoy the clips and views of Rogers' particular work. I celebrate you, Rogers, and I thank you for the opportunity for coming here to frame this presentation today. Thank you. Thank you very much.